Judith didn't realize that we'd have this many, but I hadn't even told her that the 4 would not be here today. So, at any rate, okay, can we start?
You started, so
Is
you'll hit stop when you're done.
Okay, Marvin's not a part of the class, right?
I don't think so. He looks like he's got the back door open.
Yeah,
So we'll
okay.
probably drop that one.
Okay. You know, we must be very careful. I think it was the last time that I told y'all about speaking at a ladies' event at the at one of the downtown hotels that has that bridge that connects 2 parts of the hotel, and people kept coming and going and coming and going, and there were some that were really concerned that there were men, you know, coming and going. 1 or 2 did stop and listen for a while, and I thought, you know, if they learn the gospel, or if they learn something that causes them to, you know, study more, is that a sin? You know? But we
use common sense. You didn't invite them.
yeah, we didn't invite them. It's interesting what we, in fact, I was reading an article this morning by a friend who is a preacher, and he said he was wondering where he belonged because, you know, there are areas in the Bible, like how the Holy Spirit dwells. We've got one group real extreme over here and another group real extreme over there, and never the twain shall meet, you know, and it's ridiculous. But I was disinvited. Well, I just wasn't invited back to a retreat, ladies' retreat, just because the person in charge decided that we disagreed on, and you know, she said, I think we disagree on that. I said, well, as long as we're here, you know, where the Bible teaches regarding miraculous gifts and things like that, does it matter? Well, to her it did. To me it didn't. Well, because there are things that we do need to be able to study together about and maybe come to a better understanding of the Word. But oh well, I'll get off of that and let's get to the announcements. We still want to remember Lynn Cates. Y'all could read, so I'm not going to read every word of this. And Rick Mullins has knee issues. I do too. I've been going to physical therapy twice a week and ordered some stuff from Amazon so I could do some of it at home after I have to quit going there. And they asked me if I could do a squat, you know. I hadn't been able to do that in a long time. I said, I just bend over and okay, and of course Sherilyn Nelson still has some health issues, and she would appreciate calls and words of encouragement. Chris Fry, muscular and bone and joint pain. Okay, and Philip Davis requests prayers for his brother. And of course, we all want to be in prayer for James, baby James. His surgery is Thursday, October 2nd. And of course, Nolan requested prayers to be more devoted in studying God's Word. And I think when we came here, Nolan was preschool, you know. And for some of you, you saw him as a baby, but I remember he was preschool. Okay, and then we still have in those recovering from surgery. Jerry was here Sunday. That was good, and of course Sheila has been here a couple of times, and that's been good too. Mary Martini, I think, still hasn't been able to be here, and Beth Monsenbacher. I don't know that I know her. It's Beth Monsenbacher. Okay. And of course, I do know Tanya Fallis. she's getting along as you normally get along. And Gary's going over there today, and we'll come back on Thursday. And in hospice care is, of course, Susie. And then those undergoing radiation, and especially most of us know Marshall McKee, and we want to keep Marshall and Katie in our prayers. And then we have a lot of people on the continue to remember list, and then we need people helping with the nursery on Sunday morning. Also, if you would like to go to the Louisville Ladies' Day that's on Saturday, you have to be here at 7:30. Yeah, but they did ask for us to sign up unless we just wanted to go by ourselves. But I think this is the second time Lori Boyd has spoken there at Louisville, and she usually does a good job. She's written a few books, and that's always and I think you'll be encouraged by her lessons, Strength in the Lord. And anyway, let's see. And then there's a Ladies' Day coming up on the 25th. I thought it was on the 13th. I thought it was on the 13th, not the 25th. Because I had something else on my calendar on the 25th. Oh yeah, I remember what that was now. But I was thinking this was another time, but it may not be. But at New York Avenue, and then Granbury Street. Oh, that's the one I had on my calendar too, October 18th. I'm going to try to go to that because one of the people that I know. Oh, and that's where Vicki McWilliams, and you said you knew her. Yeah, is speaking. Okay. So that I think it's good to have good ladies' days like this. They help encourage us and encourage us in a way that a lot of times, I sorry to say men don't understand, but yeah, men do understand some, but it's just good to and to be with other Christian women and to know. It encourages me to know that we have some Christian women who know the Word well and who are continuing to teach and to serve in the way that God has ordained for us to serve. I have sometimes gotten frustrated with some of the younger women that we were around when we were out at Abilene when Gary was working on his degree out there. They would say, well, the most talented person ought to preach or teach the class or whatever, and several other things that they would say. And then I have heard some say, well, as a woman, I can only teach children, teenage girls, and women. Well, duh, that's about 2/3 of the congregation. So get busy and do it instead of complain that's and want to do something else. I've always thought if we did what God has ordained for us to do, instead of be upset that we couldn't do what God has ordained the men to do, we'd be so busy we wouldn't have time to think about that. But some people like to think about that, like to feel like God has shortchanged us. And I have never felt that way. Okay, Julie is not here. So unless Mary wants to do a song, do you want to do a song? Or,
You never know what you're gonna get.
yeah, okay. Well, you definitely would know what you got if and since we're starting a little late, let's just, I'll lead the prayer this morning, and then I need to get a list of people. It seems like I'm ending up being the one to, and I keep forgetting to get a list of people who would like to lead prayer. So I will do that this morning, and then we'll continue with our class. Heavenly Father, thank you for today. Thank you for blessing us with the sunshine and the beauty of your world, and for blessing us with all the things that we need to live in this world. And thank you for blessing us with your kingdom, with your church, and with all that we need to live the way you would have us live. And Father, we ask your blessing on those who can't be here, and especially on Janice as she is concerned about that mass on her kidney. Help her to have peace, and bless the doctors as they diagnose her situation. And Father, there are others that are listed in our announcements. We think in particular of Sherilyn and of Lynn Cates and Rick Mullins and Philip Davis, and we ask, and Chris Fry, and we ask that you'll bless them and whatever they need. And Father, all of us are concerned, as you know, for baby James. So we love the Harris family, and we just pray for the doctors that you'll guide their hands, and also, Father, that you'll help James to heal and to become healthy again. And bless Nolan and Maddie as they deal with this. And Pam and Carol and Maddie's parents as they encourage and help. And Father, all those who are recovering from surgery, bless them and help them to continue to recover well. And Father, I pray especially this morning for all those mothers whose children are, adult children are not faithful to you. Father, you know their hurt. And help them to continue to be faithful and to continue to love and to continue to pray. And Father, if there's any way to work in the lives of those children to help them see that what they were taught when they were younger is really true. Father, we ask for that as well. Strengthen each one of us here today and help us to stay faithful to you. We pray in the name of Jesus. Amen. I was going to give this to anybody that wants it. I could fold it and make a paper airplane and let it fly to wherever. Let's see. There, wait, you can have that. I was just thinking about, I think it was in 3rd or 4th grade, my brother got in trouble for flying paper airplanes in the classroom. But the teacher told my mother, his fly better than any of the rest of the kids. And his hobby now is making radio-controlled airplanes. And, but he will not fly because he knows everything that could go wrong. You know, but anyway, I just thought about that. I don't know. I probably shouldn't have wasted time on it. We are on, of course, I said page 186, in Except to See Die, where Gerald talks about we too are seed for his sowing. You know, because Jesus had said, and this is about halfway through, I think, you know, Jesus had said in John 12, except a grain of seed fall into the earth and die, it remains alone. But if it dies, it brings forth much fruit. And so we dealt with a lot of that, and the idea too of his the fact that he how am I trying to say this, that he dreaded the cross, and we looked at things relating to his prayer in Gethsemane. But there are parables in Matthew 13 that relate to seed for sowing, and the first one is the parable of the sower, and we're familiar with that. Yeah, where is it? Okay. It's the first one, and here, behold, a sower went out to sow. And Jesus explains that parable, and the seed is the word. And so we get the idea, the concept there that we are to teach the word. We're to sow the seed there, and that there are different hearts that receive the word. And but there is another parable that Jesus explains, and that one is the parable of the tares, or the parable of the wheat and the tares, that he speaks about right after that. And I think it's interesting also, the next one deals with the mustard seed. All of these deal with, these three all deal with seeds and growth. But in Matthew 13, and Gerald has that parable printed out there in, I think he uses the American Standard Version. I'm going to read from what I'm used to. Another parable he put forth to them, saying, and this is Matthew 13, verse 24, the kingdom of heaven is like to a man who sowed good seed in his field, and while men slept, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat and went his way. But when the grain had sprouted and produced a crop, then the tares also appeared. So the servants of the owner came and said to him, Sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have tares? And he said to them, An enemy has done this. And the servant said to him, Do you want us to go and gather them up? But he said, No, lest when you gather up the tares, you also uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. And at the time of the harvest, I will say to the reapers, First gather together the tares and bind them in a bundle to burn them, but gather the wheat into my barns. And the disciples later asked him to explain that in verse 36. When Jesus sent the multitude away, then the disciples said to him, "Explain to us the parable of the tares in the field." And Jesus answered and said to them, "He that sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world. The good seeds are the sons of the kingdom, but the tares are the sons of the wicked one. The enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are the angels. Therefore, as the tares are gathered and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all things that offend and those who practice lawlessness, and will cast them into a furnace of fire. There will be wailing and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has an ear to hear, let him hear." There are some things that I have thought about in relation to this parable, and then Gary told me this morning when I was talking to him about it, he said, "You're thinking too much on that," which I probably was, because it's the part of it that Jesus doesn't talk about. And with a parable, you have basically one main lesson. There might be other little lessons, but there's one main lesson. And one thing that I was asking about, though, is where he says to the servants, don't gather up the tares, lest you root up the wheat along with them. And of course, my dad was a wheat farmer, so I know a lot about wheat. In fact, the day before he died, people from my hometown were calling him, because he was in the hospital in Dallas. They were calling him and saying, "Jack, my wheat is looking this way and that way. What should I do?" Or, he was the guru of wheat farming in that area. And I used to work for him too. He had a grain elevator where people brought their grain and so on. But I know this, that I believe it's veg that grows along with wheat sometimes. And when it sprouts up and when it's small, it looks kind of like wheat. It's not until it gets bigger, that you can really determine. And also, there were certain farmers that he knew tried to pass off veggie wheat, and what they would do is they would put the veggie wheat on the bottom of the trailer or the truck, and then put good wheat on top, so it looked good. But Daddy had to test the moisture in the wheat, and some of them would put really moist wheat on the bottom and then good wheat on the top. But they knew he had this moisture tester thing that went all the way down to the bottom and had little bitty cups in it that got a little bit from every part of it. They knew that, but they would always try to pass it off, and they never could. I don't know why they didn't just go ahead and say, "Here is what," and when you had something bad in the wheat, you had to dock the price, so you didn't get as good a price for it. But I kept wondering about this, lest when you gather up the tares, you root up the wheat with them. And I thought, and Gary kept telling me, "Look at what Jesus said. Did Jesus talk about that?" And no, he doesn't. And he said, "Well, the most important thing is what Jesus said in the interpretation of the parable." But I still think there's a bit there that we can look at in this sense, that the tares and the wheat, you know, they don't have free will, do they? You know, it's an illustration. They don't have free will. We do. And do Christians influence the world for better, to be better? They should, yeah. And so I think that may be one thing, but I want to get off of that because it's probably not the most important thing in this parable. And in fact, most of the time when I've heard this parable taught, I've heard it taught in the fact of we've got to teach the sons of the you know, the sons of the evil one, or we've got to tell them off, or we've got to, you know, and that was the emphasis, and yet there is that emphasis, but there's more to it than that. And I hadn't really thought about this until I was studying something that Gerald says over here, and I thought, yeah, that's what Jesus was really trying to get across. That's the main point he was trying to get across. But the man sowed good seed, and that's Jesus sowing the good seed, and the devil sowing the tares. And notice he did it at night while men slept. So, and that's the way the devil does. I think he's deceptive. He comes in when we're not aware or when we're not awake. But the main thing in regard to the parable, the main emphasis is that Jesus is the sower of good seed, and Christians are that good seed. And Jesus says the field is the world. And I know I read this over and over and over, this paragraph that, let's see, I was trying, it's the second paragraph after the end of Matthew 13, 37 to 43 that he has there. Since my page numbers are different from your page numbers here. But he says the disciples are seed for Jesus to sow wherever he wants. He is seen walking across the field, which is the world, with a satchel of seed across his shoulder. Jesus wants to spread his disciples into the field as seed. He wants us as Christians to be ripe for reproduction. And you know, we talked about last time, as Gerald has one of the statements in there, you can count how many seeds are in an apple, but you can't count how many apples are in a seed. Because you plant that seed, and if a tree grows, produces apples, and the next year produces apples, the next year, and so on. But Jesus wants to spread his church throughout the world. That's what he desires. He wants to plant us in fertile fields of human need, and for us here to fulfill our seed nature by falling into the ground ready to die for him, to become a source of life to the nations. We must die to ourselves. We must die to ourselves. And we talked about that some last week, what that meant, dying to self. Now, does that mean that Mary's got to pick up and go to Cambodia, and that Janie's got to go to Thailand, and that Charlene has got to go to Africa, and that, well, Africa's so big it'll take a bunch of us to go there. Is that what that means? No. that's not, but that means that we, wherever we are, we should be like the seed in his back. And we should be willing to die to self, to what self always wants, and what self always desires. Die to that so that we can be seed right where we are. But once seed starts growing, you know, I remember somebody that was here years ago. Oh, we've been here 20 years, 22 years. But some older lady was telling me that she had Andrew Conley in her children's Bible class. Well, she was right here. But what was she doing? Planting a seed. What happened to Andrew? Spent a lot of time in Africa, didn't he? Spent some time teaching preachers in this area. You know, you never know. And I think about Sweet Marcia. She keeps saying, I can't do anything. I feel so guilty. Look at what she has done. Look at how many elders, preachers, Bible class teachers, faithful Christians have come out of that children's Bible class that she taught. Now, have all of them been faithful? No, not all of them. They never are. But look at what the good that's done. Look at the fruit that grew up from that. And that's what Jesus is talking about here. But also, especially when we have the opportunity, when the opportunity opens up to go elsewhere, should we say, oh no, I'm scared to, I'm not gonna. When the opportunity opens up, we work through that. We die to self. And we die to self because Jesus died to self. That's what he said. Except the grain, if we fall into the earth and die, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. And Jesus was the one that the prophet spoke about in Isaiah 53. And y'all are all familiar with Isaiah 53. So I just want to look at, and if you're not real familiar with it, you can read it on your own later. But I want to just look at the last few verses that Gerald quotes here, because this was one of my favorite scriptures, and it's still one that I read sometimes during our communion to get my mind focused. And Gerald has it there in quoted in the book. But and I will tell you this: there is a fairly well-known preacher, teacher. I won't say who he is because I don't like to just. But he has bought into the fact that, not the fact, but the teaching that Isaiah's message had to mean something to the people then. And since it had to mean something to the people then, it's called authorial intent. So Isaiah's intent was to tell Israel that they were despised and rejected by men, that Israel was acquainted with grief. But then he shifts gears right at the end, and he said Israel didn't do everything God wanted them to do, so Jesus did, and so in a sense Jesus is Israel. He's trying to walk both sides of it. Usually when you try to straddle a fence, something gets hurt, right? Maybe you get hurt. And Gary has been corresponding with him about this because Gary was in Dr. John Willis's class out at ACU, and John Willis taught that very thing, only he just taught it was Israel and never even remotely talked about Jesus. You don't get that here, and especially if you go back to Isaiah 52. I'm sorry, I just had to go off on this because it has bothered me. But if you go back to Isaiah 52, where the actual what's called the servant song that Isaiah 53 is a part of. If you go back to Isaiah 52, where it actually starts, yes, the sin-bearing servant, it says, "Behold, my servant shall deal prudently, he shall be exalted and extolled and be very high. Just as many were astonished at you," listen to this, "so his visage was marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men." Is he talking about a nation or a man there? And he talking about a man? His visage was marred. And then that goes on into Isaiah 53, that, you know, but that's, anyway, I just had to say that, I'm sorry. But you may hear somebody parroting that sometimes, that this was really Israel and not Jesus. But no, he's talking about a man. And also in Acts 8, what does the eunuch say? "To whom speaks the prophet of himself?" It's a man. "Or of some other man." So he understood it to be a man, didn't he? Okay, I'll get off of that. The thing that always bothered me, though, when I was growing up, and it always bothered me to read this, that, again, that Jesus had to die. But it says down here, and this bothered me, "Yet it pleased Jehovah to bruise him. He hath put him to grief when he shall make his soul an offering for sin." I just didn't like that. But why did it please Jehovah to bruise him? It pleased Jehovah to save. It pleased him to save. And then it says, "He shall see his seed." Oh. "He shall prolong his days, and the pleasure of Jehovah shall prosper in his hand." What is that? Jesus was a seed for sowing, but it says he will see his seed. Oh, that's us, the seed for sowing. And oh, Gerald says that here. I didn't know he did. Huh, okay. "The seed are followers of Christ, who have been given life because he fell into the ground and died." And then he repeats this passage, which I think we'll repeat it also, since we just used it last week. "And Jesus answered them, saying, The hour is come that the Son of Man should be glorified. Verily, verily, I say unto you, except a grain of wheat fall into the earth and die, it abides by itself alone, but if it dies, it beareth much fruit." And then he says, it ends this with, "If any man serve me, let him follow me, and where I am, there also my servant will be. If any man serve me, him will my Father honor." And then he gives us an example. Gerald gives us an example of one who said Paul seemed to grasp all of the implications of this dual assignment. The idea of being seed for Jesus sowing, and then what he was to do in dying to himself. And you again, these are things that you're familiar with. If you read through the book of Acts, you see the actions of Paul. through this, but he says we're God's fellow workers. I was a master builder. I laid the foundation. That's 1 Corinthians chapter 3, 9 through 11. And also, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. And then in 1 Corinthians 1:17, he said that Jesus didn't send him to baptize, but to preach the gospel. In other words, he was to sow the seed. Now, when you sow the seed, and if the seed bears fruit, what does that person do? If
Should bear more fruit.
yeah, but I'm trying to, I didn't ask the question right. If you teach someone the gospel, and that someone understands the gospel and wants to respond to the gospel and become seed, what does that person do then? That person wants to be baptized. Yes, that person. Now, God didn't say go and baptize ever, did he? He said go and teach and then baptize. Yeah. That's what Paul is meaning here. And I've heard people twist that around and use it as that baptism's not important. Because Paul said God didn't send him to baptize, but to preach the gospel. But once you respond to the gospel, that's what you do, and that's what Jesus said in Matthew 28, Mark 16, and so forth. But notice that Paul's emphasis was always on the gospel. It was always on what that he was just God's instrument. And he says we have this treasure in earthen vessels, that the exceeding greatness of the power may be of God and not of ourselves. And that's important. Sometimes we have a tendency, in fact, wasn't this what the Corinthian brethren were doing? I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Cephas. Apollos was a very eloquent person. Oh, I just love to hear Apollos speak. Don't we sometimes follow men? Don't we sometimes have our favorite and what this one says is law? I don't think any of us in here, now I do, because I remember hearing Avon Malone years ago, and I told him, I said, I'm coming to hear my second favorite preacher. And he said, well, that's the way it ought to be. But, does it matter who preaches the gospel? Does it matter? As long as the gospel is preached. And in fact, Paul says that in the first chapter of Philippians, that he said that some even preach the gospel for the wrong reasons. And he said, I just rejoice that the gospel's preached. I just rejoice that the gospel is preached. And that's the way we should be. Notice in 2 Corinthians 12 and 15, Paul says, I will most gladly spend and be spent for your souls. And then, yea, if I'm offered upon the sacrifice and service of your faith, I joy and rejoice with you all, in Philippians 2, verse 7. And then in 2 Corinthians 4, he lists several things he's undergone. Well, that was Paul, and we might say, whew, I couldn't do that. Yeah. But I think it's in Acts chapter 9, as I was thinking about this today, or yesterday, that was when I was thinking about it. In Acts chapter 9 and verse 15, when the Lord tells Ananias to go to Saul. And in verse 15, the Lord said to him, "Go, for he is a chosen vessel of mine to bear my name before Gentiles, kings, and the children of Israel, for I will show him how many things he must suffer for my name's sake." Paul was a chosen vessel for a certain reason, in the early preaching and teaching of the gospel. And when he's put in prison in Rome and under house arrest, did he just sit there? No, he taught people as they came and went to visit him. And he also wrote, where did I write this down? Or maybe Gerald wrote this down somewhere. Did he write this down? Oh, I had it written down. At the end of the book of Acts, when he was there, he wrote Ephesians, Colossians, Philippians, and Galatians. Are we glad he was in prison? Yeah. He didn't just sit there and say, "I'm in prison, I can't do anything." He wrote these letters that we are still encouraged about. Mary, you look like you had something to say again.
Well, you did it. When you were talking about Paul saying that there were some that preached the gospel for reasons that were not the right reasons, I thought, okay, there's a tear. He's preaching the gospel for the wrong reason, but he's getting good results.
Yeah.
Therefore, let's don't tear him out, because
yeah.
he's getting people to believe. He may not be saved, but the people he's contacting and talking to are being saved. So,
I'm going to tell Gary that when I get home. Mary gave me the answer there. Yeah, you know, when you put things together and you see what's, but I thought about this too. Paul was unmarried. He didn't have to be as concerned about a wife or children, did he? And Gary and I have talked about the fact that we're glad that this opportunity to go and teach in other places opened up after our children were away from home, because it was good for Dad to be at basketball games and band concerts and plays and stuff like that. It was good for Dad to be at home with them, and because saving them is important too. But I think it's in 1 Corinthians 9, Paul even talks about that a bit, and y'all may be aware of this. In 1 Corinthians 9, what is it, 5 through 17 is where it, but I'll just, he is defending himself. He is defending himself because the Corinthians were so, about everything. But in verse 5, he says, in verse 4, he says, do we have no right to eat and drink? Do we have no right to take along a believing wife, as do also the other apostles? So the other apostles were married. The brothers of our Lord, and Cephas, or Peter, says, or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working? See, they were supporting, fully supporting these others, and it was okay, but they were griping at Paul. And what did Paul do? He didn't take a cent from the Corinthians because he didn't want them to say, you're doing it for the money. And people sometimes who don't want to pay preachers look at that and say, well, Paul wasn't paid. Well, he was at times. He was at times. But he just didn't take money from the Corinthian brethren because of the way they would have looked at that. But the others were supported. In fact, you find that, I think it's in Titus somewhere, right at the end of the book of Titus. he says, bring Zenas the lawyer and Apollos, I believe it is, on their way, that nothing be lacking. He said, help them out as they go. And that doesn't mean just pat them on the back and say, well, go on your way. He said that nothing be lacking, that they have what they need to continue in the work that they're doing. And we're good about that here, but I know some places that aren't and some people that aren't. And it's, Johnny Ramsey used to say, don't preach for nothing because people won't value it, you know, and I don't know if that's necessarily true, but he also wouldn't let Iris speak anywhere unless they paid her exactly what they would pay him for the same number of lessons. And I told Gary, I said, I always like to speak where Iris has been because they'll ask me, you know, what do you charge? Well, I usually say I've been paid all the way from thank you to way too much, so anything in between is fine with me. I'm not, you know, I'm not doing this. But it is nice when people take care of your expenses at least, you know, something like that. And every cent that I get is always put back in either a travel fund or my book fund, you know, and all that kind of thing. I told that to one group, I think it was down at Colleen, yeah. I said everything, you know, I put it, so they gave me a check, you know, and then they gave me a gift card to certain place, you know, so that I couldn't put that in my, which was appreciated, of course, but that's a kind of off the subject here. But I was thinking about this right at the end. Gerald says it's easy to see this special seed of Jesus choosing fall into the earth and die so he can bear much fruit. But I was thinking about, and we've still got a few minutes because we started late. I was thinking about, what about us? What about ordinary Christians? Is there something, you know, because we can look at Paul, and I was trying to get this out. We can look at Paul and we can get, you know, we can feel guilty, or we can say, well, I can't do that. And I remember a missionary years ago who would use this as kind of to put the rest of us on a guilt trip. And boy, I got on that guilt trip real quick, you know, because I thought, well, we need to be, you know, why aren't we doing? Not all of us can do what Paul was doing, and he was a special vessel. But all of us can do something, and I pulled out an old lesson that I'm not going to do all of this. I'm just going to give you the main points that I had in this. But if you look through the book of Acts, if you just look through the book of Acts, and y'all can do this on your own sometime, but the first thing that you notice about the church in general, the seed that Jesus sowed there in Jerusalem, and then Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the earth. If you look there, you find that it wasn't just the apostles that were doing all of the work. And in fact, what is it, Acts chapter 8, where is it, Acts chapter 8, here it is. Saul was the one who was breathing out threats and everything, and it says against the church, which was at Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the region of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. So the normal, ordinary Christians who had just become seed for planting were scattered. And verse 4 said, therefore those, and that included women too, it wasn't just the men that were scattered. Therefore those who were scattered went everywhere. And the word preaching there, the better translation is just talking, because that was what it said. They went everywhere talking the word, telling what had occurred, evangelizing. And then you have Philip going into Samaria and so on. So I thought about, they had a message that they wanted to share. Do we have a message we want to share? And if we do, we'll find ways to share that message. And we'll find someone to share that message with. They also lived as servants of another master. You know, John used the parable of the talents this Sunday. And, you know, the money belonged to the master. It never belonged to them. It belonged to the master all the time. So anything that you have that you can, you know, my education is not my education. It's God's education. It's what He has given me to use. And it means something out here in the world. It meant something. It doesn't really mean that I'm any better than any of the rest of you. It meant that I could be an assistant professor out there. But here, it doesn't mean anything that I'm any better than the high school dropout. You know, that's not what it's all about. That we have, you know, and if you read through the book of Acts, you find that. You also find that there are some problems that we. I remember Tanya was in the band at Abilene Christian School, and she played the euphonium, and she said, you know, my part sounds, you know, not so good when I'm practicing. But it's nice that my little part sounds good when the whole band gets together. And you know, you might think, well, my little part's not much. But when the whole bunch of us get together, your little part sounds good. You know, so it's a good thing. Another thing, they had their priorities in order. We've talked about that a little bit here. They would stand together. You know, in Acts chapter 2, we see that they had singleness of heart, you know, worshiping and serving and teaching. In Acts chapter 4, when there was a need, they some of them sold their possessions to meet that need. In Acts chapter 6, they resolve a problem of benevolence. So they tried to work together. Now, you know, later on in Corinthians that it got shaky because we're people and we try to do that. You know, we bring the world into the church and our thoughts that we had. But early on, this is what was going on, and I think about this. I was, Peyton played basketball, and I just loved to watch him play basketball, you know, and he was the point guard. If you don't, do you know what the point guard is? He's the one that brings the ball down, sets up the plays and all like that. And always enjoyed watching him play. And in one game, and I always kept up with his points and everything, you know, like a good mother should. And one game, he inbounded the ball, and Chris missed it. And the team, you know, there was a turnover. And after the game, I said, Peyton, was that turnover charged to you or to Chris? He said, what difference does it make? The team got a turnover. That taught me something. We're good at blaming somebody or at exalting somebody, but if somebody messes up, the team got a turnover. And if somebody scores really well, the team won. And we, thinking in terms, and you know, you meet people like Dorcas in there, and when Paul was let down over the Damascus with a rope, there were a lot of people that had to hold that rope, weren't there? And somebody had to make the rope, donate the rope. Somebody had to let them use the basket. And what they say, my grandmother made that basket, you're not about to use it. No, it's, here's a basket, let's use it. You know, so we see that kind of thing. Barnabas, who was the son of exhortation, who exhorted or who encouraged others, and that's what we need to do. And relying on God and His wisdom, and I remember Gene Coffey saying this a lot of times too, that the providence of God is underrated. The providence of God is underrated. And I thought about that, and you know, and you have to live long enough to look back at your life and see how God was working to, and all like that. But if you read Acts 23, verses 16, 22, and 23 particularly, there's not a miracle at all here. And that's what I love about it. We think that, oh, the miracles helped. Well, yes, they validated the word. But Paul's nephew learns that there's a plot by the Jews against him. And so he goes and tells Paul, and Paul says, well, you tell the centurion. The centurion then tells those in charge, and they get 470 soldiers to escort one preacher from Jerusalem to Caesarea. Yeah. 470 Roman soldiers to escort one preacher. I just love that. And there's not a miracle at all. There's not a miracle at all. But how are Felix, Festus, and Agrippa going to hear the gospel? You've got to put a notable prisoner in their prison, and they're going to hear the gospel. And then when he gets to Rome, at taxpayer expense, the church didn't have to pay anything. They're saints in Caesar's household. It's an amazing story of just God's providence, and I just love that. And then they worked also for future generations. You know, Paul taught in the school of Tyrannus for 2 years there in Ephesus. And also, you know, when Paul was in Rome, he wrote when there was danger there and when they were disappointed. Paul especially mentions Luke and Demas greet you, and Philemon in about 61 to 63 AD, and in Colossians 4 and 14, he mentions Luke and Demas again, or he lists Demas as a fellow laborer. But about 3 years later, in 2 Timothy 4 and 10, he says, Demas has forsaken me, having loved the present world. Some people will fall away. Some people that we love very much might fall away. But we keep going. We keep going. And I had down here one thing, and y'all know this anyway. I can't do everything, but I can do something. Even when I'm old, I can do something. It may be just encouraging the younger ones. That may be the only thing I can do. But I can do something. And I can't go everywhere, but I am somewhere. And so if we do the something we can do in the somewhere where we are, it gets done. It gets done. It's done. And the only German, well, okay, Gary sent me his text. Okay, you're right. All right. But the only German I know is, well, I know 2 or 3 other German phrases, but das ist alles. That is all. Okay. It's amazing what you remember from. And I'll turn this off so that we can gossip. No. Yeah.